Stop what you think you know about this broadcast for a moment. What looked like routine morning banter on a major Christian network has become the latest chapter in a story about power, trust, and alleged abuse that refuses to stay private. If you want to follow this closely, hit the subscribe button now and turn on your bell so you get first-hand updates as this story develops. Joni Lamb's decision to host Rod Parsley is being called by critics a serious lapse in discernment, and for reasons that go beyond a single guest booking. In religious circles, discernment is not just a pious word, it's the expectation that those who steward platforms, especially platforms built on faith and trust, exercise careful moral judgment about who they elevate and why. When a network with Daystar's reach invites a figure like Rod Parsley to appear, it's not merely a programming choice, it's a public signal about values, judgment, and priorities. For viewers and donors who give their money and attention believing in the integrity of the ministry, that signal matters. Critics argue that hosting Parsley amounts to normalizing, or at least overlooking, allegations that have shadowed him for years. The concern is twofold. First is the immediate, practical responsibility of protecting vulnerable people who may have raised complaints or come forward with troubling stories. If serious allegations exist, putting the subject of those allegations in front of a camera without addressing concerns is an affront to anyone harmed. Second is the reputational consequence for a network that once carried the moral authority of its founders. When a station's leaders appear to be tone-deaf or unconcerned about credible reports, trust erodes quickly, and with it the moral authority that viewers grant. There are also internal institutional dynamics that make this more than a single-person failure. As CEO and public face, Joni Lamb occupies a role where decisions are inherently political and pastoral. The choice to feature Parsley raises questions about vetting, editorial oversight, and the process by which guests are cleared. Who at the network reviews allegations? Are legal and pastoral counselors consulted? Are independent checks applied when a guest has a contentious history? When these processes are missing or opaque, even well-intended decisions can look like willful blindness. Beyond structural questions, there's the emotional and spiritual fallout. For survivors who track these stories, seeing a disputed figure welcomed with warmth can feel like a fresh injury. It sends the signal that reputation and ratings may outweigh accountability and care. That perception drives people away from the institution, not just from the broadcast. Faith, for many, is intimate and vulnerable. When institutions mishandle allegations, they damage people's faith in the institution and sometimes in the faith itself. At root, critics are calling for three things that would signal genuine discernment: recognition of the problem, humility in response, and concrete steps to address risk. Recognition means saying openly that allegations exist and that they will be taken seriously. Humility means pausing the platforming until questions are answered rather than doubling down. Concrete steps mean instituting independent reviews, transparent policies for guest vetting, and clear care pathways for those who come forward with complaints. If Joni Lamb and her team hope to restore confidence, they must show they understand that discernment isn't a one-time skill but an ongoing stewardship practice. The consequences of appearing to fail at that are not merely reputational, they are pastoral. Trust broken by a single broadcast can take years to rebuild, and it requires not only different decisions but a demonstrable change in how decisions are made. Until that shift happens, many will view the decision to host Parsley as emblematic of deeper problems in leadership and governance. The opening minutes of that Daystar interview, which many have described as awkward and tone-deaf, matter more than producers might have expected. Television openings set the scene, establish tone, and implicitly tell the audience what to take seriously. When a serious and contested figure is introduced with light banter and scripted affection, "You are my favorite person," the effect is jarring. It sends the subtext that the controversy is either irrelevant or manageable, that the guest's alleged past is secondary to the comfort of on-air personalities. For anyone trying to raise alarm or seeking accountability, that tone can feel like an erasure of harm. What's striking in the clip critics dissected is the mismatch between form and content. The producers lean into amiable, domestic banter, playful admonitions, jokes about complimenting a spouse, laugh tracks, and gentle coaching. That style works for uplifting features and human interest pieces, but it clashes with the weight of the allegations tied to the guest. The result is cognitive dissonance for viewers. Their ears hear lightness while their minds hold the seriousness of the claims. This mismatch is not merely an aesthetic problem, it's a credibility problem. Tone management is an editorial responsibility. Responsible broadcasting requires calibrating approach to content. When allegations involve potential criminal conduct or patterns of spiritual abuse, producers have a duty to frame interviews differently, by noting the controversy, by allowing space for tough questions, or by inviting voices that represent survivors and investigators into the conversation. Failure to do so makes the broadcast look like a carefully staged rehabilitation rather than a public reckoning. Even more, it weakens confidence in the network's ability to self-regulate. This criticism extends to the network's gatekeeping practices behind the camera. Who approved the segment, and on what basis? Was there editorial discussion about how to handle the guest's past? Did producers weigh the risks of alienating viewers or re-traumatizing survivors? Without clear answers, the default conclusion for many is that the opening was not an oversight but a deliberate, careless choice. That perception, true or not, amplifies outrage. For audiences, such openings can also harden entrenched views. Supporters may dismiss criticism as media-driven gotcha tactics, while skeptics see confirmation of rot. That polarization makes it harder to achieve the middle ground that institutions need to repair trust, the middle ground where admission, accountability, and corrective action can occur. The opening's lightness, therefore, isn't just a production flaw, it has real consequences for community reconciliation and institutional restoration. At a minimum, the network's editorial team needs to acknowledge the mismatch and explain their standards for guest vetting and tone setting. Doing that transparently would not erase past mistakes, but it would show an awareness of the harm that tone-deaf openings can cause. Until then, every new guest booking will be evaluated not only for the content it promises but for what its opening says about the institution's values. Many viewers and watchdogs point to a long list of allegations tied to Rod Parsley, sexual misconduct, spiritual and doctrinal manipulation, and ethically questionable symbolism in his ministry spaces, and stress that these are serious enough to demand a sober public response. Those claims, reported by activists and investigative outlets, are not incidental whispers. They include accounts of troubling behavior and institutional patterns that, if true, point to abuse and cover-up. But the distinction between accusation and conviction remains critical. These are allegations and concerns that warrant independent scrutiny rather than summary judgment. The community impact of long-running allegations is profound. When a leader accumulates decades of influence, the number of voices affected grows with time. Former staff members, congregants, and families may carry experiences that differ widely. Some report spiritual manipulation, an abuse of authority that isolates victims and discourages reporting. Others allege patterns of sexual misconduct. Still others point to symbolic elements, artifacts and imagery in worship spaces, that raise questions about the leader's associations and messaging. Taken together, these claims suggest a pattern that merits investigation on both pastoral and legal grounds. What complicates the situation is the broader cultural environment that enables long-tenured leaders to persist despite controversy. Ministries often build deep loyalty among followers, and that loyalty can insulate leaders from consequence. Donations, broadcasting reach, and institutional loyalty create layers of protection that make allegations harder to address. When accusations surface, the choice many organizations make is defensive, deny, minimize, or isolate the accusers. That reaction erodes public trust and can re-traumatize those who step forward. Yet, demands for accountability cannot sidestep due process. Independent inquiries, not social media trials, offer the most credible route to clarity. A fair process protects the rights of the accused while honoring the testimony of survivors. It also guards the institution's credibility by refusing to be swayed by rumor or factional pressure. The point critics emphasize is simple: decades of influence do not grant immunity from scrutiny, in fact, they heighten the need for it. At the pastoral level, leaders must also reckon with the spiritual harm that doctrinal abuse can cause. Spiritual abuse is subtle. It can be coercion wrapped in prayer, manipulation disguised as pastoral care, or authority leveraged to silence dissent. Where such dynamics exist, the damage is often long-term and not easily remedied by a single public apology. Restorative work requires structural reform, counseling access, and an institutional willingness to listen. Part of the controversy centers on allegations of occult symbolism and imagery connected to the ministry, claims that a sword with Nazi or occult symbols hangs on a wall, or that artifacts bearing all-seeing eyes and skull imagery have been displayed. For many, such symbolism is more than aesthetic, it signals alignment with questionable iconography and raises alarm about ideological associations. Symbolic artifacts in a place of worship carry semiotic weight. They tell a story about the values and influences behind a ministry. If those artifacts include imagery tied to extremist or occult traditions, observers are right to ask how and why they are present. Equally troubling in these accounts are repeated claims that reports of abuse were downplayed, covered up, or met with retribution. Whistleblowers describe being silenced or threatened, and survivors recount institutional obstacles when they try to bring their stories forward. Patterns of cover-up, if verified, are especially dangerous because they convert individual wrongdoing into systemic failure. Cover-ups protect perpetrators and punish victims, turning a moral institution into one that replicates the very harms it should oppose. These combined reports of problematic imagery, alleged spiritual manipulation, and alleged cover-ups create a narrative that cannot be dismissed as mere rumor. Even if some details are contested, the accumulation of concerns imposes a responsibility on networks like Daystar to respond transparently. Silence or defensiveness will only validate the worst fears of critics and deepen the sense of betrayal among those who trusted the ministry. Daystar is also being accused of ignoring whistleblowers and investigative reporting, and that accusation goes to the heart of institutional responsibility. When concerns surface publicly, through activist channels, journalists, or former insiders, an ethical institution conducts or commissions an independent review, clarifies facts, and protects those who come forward. But critics argue that Daystar has, in multiple instances, failed to do so. Instead of cooperating with inquiries or commissioning unbiased third-party investigations, they claim the network has too often defaulted to defensive posturing. Ignoring whistleblowers has real consequences. People who attempt to raise questions internally and are rebuffed often take their message outside the institution. When their concerns are then dismissed or ignored by leadership, they turn to alternative outlets, blogs, activist platforms, and independent video channels to be heard. That dynamic both escalates public attention and deepens the divide between the institution and those it serves. A refusal to engage with whistleblowers signals an institutional preference for image protection over truth-seeking. Investigative reporting plays a crucial role in any healthy democracy, and it functions as a needed check on powerful institutions, including religious organizations. When journalists or independent investigators unearth troubling patterns, an accountable institution should treat that reporting as a prompt for an earnest, transparent response. Avoiding engagement, attacking the messenger, or trying to discredit evidence without opening a meaningful inquiry undermines moral credibility. Moreover, ignoring investigations often fosters suspicion that the institution values self-preservation over people's safety. Donors, viewers, and staff need to know there is a mechanism for truth, a route for allegations to be weighed by people who have no financial or relational ties to the leadership. Without that, every denial is hollow, and every internal probe is perceived as toothless. That perception eats away at trust faster than any external scandal. Beyond the immediate controversy, critics see this case as emblematic of a broader failure across segments of evangelical leadership to maintain moral accountability. Patterns repeat, charismatic leaders ascend, institutions centralize power, oversight weakens, and when allegations arise, mechanisms for redress are inadequate. This isn't merely about individual missteps, it's about structural vulnerabilities that allow abuse to flourish and persist. At the center of this systemic critique is the interplay of authority and insulation. Large ministries often concentrate decision-making in a small cadre of leaders who enjoy close personal loyalty from staff and supporters. That closeness can become a liability when it prevents independent oversight. Boards become deferential, internal audits are minimal, and dissenting voices are marginalized. Over time, the feedback loops that correct error wither, and the institution moves from being accountable to being unaccountable. The cultural dynamics within some evangelical circles can also contribute to the problem. An ethos that privileges absolute pastoral authority or interprets dissent as spiritual rebellion can make it hard for victims to speak. Scriptural language about submission and unity, when weaponized, can silence questions and shield abusers. The result is a community that values preservation of leadership image over protection of the vulnerable. Reforming this culture means rethinking governance. It means strengthening boards with independent members, instituting transparent financial practices, and creating safe channels for reporting abuse that are managed outside the power structure of the ministry. Training on abuse recognition, mandatory reporter policies, and external audits are not bureaucratic luxuries, they are essential protections for those the ministry claims to serve. A related and equally contentious issue is the accumulation of wealth by prominent pastors and the perception that that wealth is built on the backs of trusting donors. The criticism is not a rejection of fair compensation, it is a demand for proportionality and transparency. When leaders amass multiple homes, luxury travel, or lavish facilities, while the stated mission is service and charity, donors have a right to know how funds are used and whether governance structures ensure accountable stewardship. The optics of wealth in ministry are powerful. Donors often give with the expectation that their gifts will support outreach, aid, and community programs, not to underwrite an expanding personal estate. When ministries avoid transparent reporting of salaries, housing allowances, and capital expenditures, suspicions arise that resources benefit a small elite more than the mission. In the long run, that perception corrodes giving and undermines the ministry's capacity to do good. Legal and non-profit regulations exist precisely to prevent such abuses. Audited financial statements, IRS filings, and clear policies on related party transactions are basic safeguards. Critics argue that many ministries treat these as optional or do the minimum necessary to comply without truly embracing a culture of accountability. That defensive posture allows leaders to benefit from blurred lines and keeps donors in the dark. Financial transparency is also a pastoral issue. Stewardship is a spiritual discipline in many traditions, and leaders who fail to model it betray the trust placed in them. For institutions that preach sacrifice and generosity, opaque wealth accumulation looks like hypocrisy. Addressing those concerns requires more than promises, it requires independent audits, public reporting, and governance reforms that separate financial oversight from charismatic authority. Mounting calls for an unbiased, third-party investigation into Daystar's alleged mishandling of abuse claims grow louder because internal reviews are perceived as inherently conflicted. An independent investigation brings impartiality, credibility, and a scope that internal processes often lack. For credibility, investigators must be selected without ties to the network, no family members, no donors, no longtime supporters. Their mandate should include full access to records, the authority to interview staff and witnesses, and a commitment to publish findings. A credible third-party inquiry also needs procedural safeguards. Survivors must be able to come forward confidentially and be offered protections from retaliation. Those accused must have the opportunity to respond, and legal counsel should be available to ensure fairness. The investigation's terms should be publicly stated, what questions will be asked, what timeframe will be covered, and how conflicts of interest will be handled. Transparency about process builds trust in outcomes. Obstacles to such investigations are predictable: fear of reputational damage, potential legal exposure, and internal resistance from those who benefit from the status quo. To overcome these barriers, stakeholders, donors, board members, and faith leaders must insist on transparency and be willing to accept uncomfortable findings. That insistence may require tangible actions such as temporary leadership transitions, freezing fundraising for certain projects, or cooperating fully with civil authorities where criminal allegations exist. When organizations agree to independent reviews, the results are not always neat. Investigations can reveal gray areas, confirm some allegations, and exonerate others. But the public good lies in honesty. Even a flawed institution can begin to heal when it commits to truth-seeking and implements the reforms recommended by impartial experts. The continued presence of figures like Joshua Brown on Daystar's platform has fueled accusations of institutional protectionism, especially from those who say his behavior was known internally yet not addressed publicly. Repeated appearances by controversial personalities suggest either a failure to act or an institutional choice to preserve relationships over accountability. When allegations of intimidation or inappropriate advances surface, and the accused continues to receive airtime and prominence, it looks like the institution is protecting insiders rather than serving truth. This pattern serves two harmful functions. First, it signals to survivors that their complaints are less important than the network's alliances. Victims may feel discouraged from coming forward if they see a clear pattern of insiders being shielded. Second, it sends a message to staff and other ministries that loyalty to certain personalities is rewarded more than ethical conduct. That creates perverse incentives where silence becomes the currency of advancement. Repairing that damage requires clear personnel decisions, suspensions pending investigation, public statements about why a person is not being featured, and visible steps toward reconciliation and justice. Without such measures, the mere continuation of contested figures on the air will be interpreted as tacit endorsement. Leaked recordings of Joni Lamb confronting her son have deepened public concern because they provide a rare, intimate window into the family dynamics behind the ministry's public face. Family conflicts are private by nature, but when a family also runs an influential broadcast platform, private interactions become matters of public consequence. Listeners who hear alleged harshness or abuse in those interactions worry about the culture modeled by leadership and the precedent it sets for how internal dissent is handled. Leaks complicate matters further. They often arrive with partial context and invite speculation. Yet when they indicate a pattern, public scolding, dismissive language, or emotional cruelty, they contribute to a broader narrative about a leadership style that is authoritarian and unrepentant. For many observers, such recordings are not just sensational audio, they are evidence that the culture of power within the institution extends into the personal realm in ways that are unhealthy and possibly abusive. What is required now is not voyeuristic satisfaction but a commitment to truth, accountability, and pastoral care. If the recordings are accurate, an apology is not sufficient unless followed by restorative steps, professional counseling for those harmed, independent review of decision-making practices, and structural changes that prevent personal conflict from translating into institutional abuse. The wider lesson in this unfolding story is stark. Institutions built on trust cannot survive prolonged ambiguity about ethics and accountability. Platforming controversial figures without addressing credible allegations damages institutional credibility and harms those the ministry claims to protect. Independent investigations are not merely bureaucratic niceties, they are essential when allegations of criminal or moral wrongdoing arise. Donors and congregants deserve transparent stewardship of their resources, and leaders who amass wealth must answer for how those resources are used. Whistleblowers and victims must be protected, listened to, and offered channels for safe reporting. Moral authority in faith leadership depends on transparency, humility, and genuine repentance, none of which can be simulated by warm smiles and light banter. If you care about these issues, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss developments. We'll keep tracking this story as it evolves, reporting carefully on what is alleged, what is proven, and what reforms, if any, follow. The demand for truth is not about tearing institutions down for the sake of spectacle, it's about ensuring that ministries live up to the standards they preach and protect the people they claim to serve.